Robyn Pender, retired from historic England after 18 years advising on the performance of historic buildings and climate change, but is still researching and communicating on the topic. I hope you're not retired because you are given up.
No, I'm not.
Stage is yours.
I'm actually retired because I could say the things that needed to be said, which when you work for a government organisation is not always possible. And that's one reason it's so exciting to be with you and with such like-minded people, because I really do believe that those of us working in the historic built environment have the skills and the knowledge and even the obligation to call out the unrecognised but dangerously wrong paradigms that have got us into this mess, to expose why we're here and how we got here, and by doing that show that just as the problem isn't as it's currently being framed, the solutions are there in history. Cheaper and easier and offering all sorts of additional benefits, including truly better health and comfort. I'm lucky enough to be one of the organisers of the Built Environment and Infrastructure Working Group of the Climate Heritage Network, and the huge strength of the CHN lies not in us, but in the many Global South colleagues, Global South being, it includes the Arctic, which is a bit weird, and doesn't include Australia, where I come from, but never mind. Global South colleagues in our group, we have lots of them, and the story I want to tell you this morning that I know by applying history and science, they can back up with ongoing practice in vernacular buildings. Basically, this is a story of how everything changes at the Industrial Revolution as we start drawing on apparently unlimited quantities of fossil fuel slaves. Everything from knowledge transfer to societies and economies, which is why we've ended up with what feels like such a wicked problem. So the key to untangling that is to go back to a time pre-carbon. So when people talk about old buildings and are thinking of these, for me, these are still pretty recent. We need to go further back to think about how buildings worked when energy was incredibly expensive and incredibly hard to exploit. Now, I could spend my 15 minutes just on the different way we once made building envelopes and explaining the tried and tested greatcoat construction that served us so well for tens of thousands of years, and comparing it to the much shorter-lived and less effective high-energy raincoat construction that we're still putting up everywhere in the global north. But there's another story that's at least as important, and it's much less well-known. And that's the story... Oh, sorry, I seem to have got an extra slide. That's the story of how and why we operate buildings changed dramatically too once we got energy on tap. The essential science that explains this is thermal physiology, how we physically interact with our surroundings to keep our metabolic processes working properly. We in the global north seem to have developed some really weird ideas around this over the past 100 years or so, so it's very much worth setting the record straight by going back to basics. And the basic thing is we aren't like cups of coffee, just passively losing heat into our surroundings until our skin's at the same temperature as it would be if it were just thermodynamics. But most of the modeling does assume that's how it goes. Actually, we are warm-blooded, and like all warm-blooded animals, we are the heat source in the room, and we evolved an incredibly complex thermoregulatory system designed to turn most of the food and oxygen that we take in into heat to keep our vital organs at exactly the right temperature to work properly. If the brain and the heart and lungs and so on go outside a really narrow temperature band, their cells will start to die, so we die too. But since we are continually generating heat, we will always need to be losing some of it, even when it's very cold, just not too much. So we have all sorts of clever control mechanisms for getting that balance right, and it's a dynamic balance. It's changing all the time as we move around, as our surroundings change, as we do different things. Thermoregulation is really complex, but a lot of it is centered around the skin and especially the blood, which carries the heat around the body as well as all the nutrients. So your body pumps more blood into the skin and the extremities when you need to lose more of your heat, and it draws it back when you're losing too much. So your hands and feet start to feel cold and turn blue. The physics of exactly how we lose our heat into our surroundings is super important to all of this. So we lose some by touch. How much depends on what we're touching and how much of our body is touching it. We lose some into the air, and that's mostly by evaporation from the skin. So you might lose close to the maximum you could in this way. If you've jumped out naked and sweating out of a sauna at night in winter into a stiff breeze, But that's still going to be less than 22% of your total heat loss. And into the indoors air, it's more like the minimum, just a few percent, even if the air is very cold, which of course leaves the $64,000 question, where is all the rest of it going? Well, the biggest way we lose heat by far is by radiating it out into our surroundings, and that's at least 65% of our heat loss. But if we're wearing light clothing and we're surrounded by surfaces that keep absorbing our heat, that can go up to as much as 80 to 85%. So radiant loss is far and away the most important factor for thermal comfort. But currently, in the global north, it's almost entirely neglected in the way we design and the way we operate our buildings. That's now all based on controlling the air temperature, of course. But pre-carbon people took an entirely different approach to thermal comfort that was almost entirely passive. No, they didn't use fireplaces and stoves for that, except incidentally. That's a post-carbon idea that's been perpetuated by about 1 million video games and fantasy novels. The genuine medieval images show us those enormous hearths being used for tiny fires for cooking. They're that size to make sure they got rid of all the combustion gases. And when they're not being used for cooking, the pictures show them sealed over with panels and settles and cloth. In the north, we did get a bit of a blip of energy being used for heating buildings when the Romans arrived. They didn't know how to dress or build for the northern climate, but instead of learning from the natives with their trousers and thick earth walls and some passive tricks I'm going to get onto, they decided to try to transfer their hypercourse system from their bathhouses back in Rome into their villas. And just like us, the Romans are addicted to technical solutions to non-technical problems. They burnt so many trees to run this, it was really completely unsustainable. So it's no surprise when they left, the locals went straight back to what they'd been doing for centuries. And what they were doing and kept doing was this: slashing that huge component of radiant loss directly just by putting up simple barriers between their bodies and all the heat-absorbing surfaces around them. Draperies and canopies and rugs that could be hung up in winter and then could be stored away in summer when some radiant loss was actually really useful. They didn't need to cover all the surfaces, often just where people were sitting quietly. And the cloths weren't one-trick ponies. They were used at the same time to control air movement, that next biggest contributor to feeling too hot or too cold. And all this drapery was obviously effective. By slashing the biggest contributor to thermal discomfort without worrying about the air temperature, they could open their windows, even in winter, and we can see from the paintings that's exactly what they did. And we also know from what they wrote that masses of fresh air was exactly what they wanted too. And this way of controlling and exploiting radiant heat loss is still used everywhere in vernacular buildings in the global south. And what's exciting, but perhaps shouldn't be surprising, is how closely all this fits with the latest research from the thermal physiologists. They've been showing that exposure to temperature extremes can reverse not just obesity and blood pressure problems, but even type 2 diabetes. And if that's not enough, so perhaps actually it's no accident that the increase in those conditions in the global north mirrors the increasing control of interior environments. And if that's not enough, the physiologists are also pointing out that if we're exposed to a wider range of thermal conditions, then we're actually more comfortable too, because the thermoregulatory system is use it or lose it. So if you pickle yourself in controlled conditions, it shuts down and it takes a while to start it up again. And that means you end up noticing even the tiniest changes in your thermal surroundings, things that your body would normally just neutralize without you even noticing. And anyone who's ever been camping knows that's true. For the first few days, you feel every change in your bones, but then you barely notice them. And that's not psychological, it's physiological. So what happened to the draperies? 1 minute they're everywhere, and the next minute they're pretty much forgotten. In the UK, they disappear around the time of the Great Plague, and people did know that was spread by fleas, which gave the draperies a bad name and made them unfashionable. They'd probably have come back again, but lots of other things were changing at the same time. They'd started to make glass with coal, which made glazed windows affordable, so building envelopes start to change dramatically. And unlike, say, making bricks or lime, making glass wasn't a local activity. It needed not just masses of energy, but also special materials. So they used the new canals to bring everything they needed into one place, and then for sending the finished glass away to market. But this meant that glass had to be made by a company, an entrepreneur, and that's the beginnings of a commodity-led approach to buildings that's at the heart of many of our problems today, including all of our unhelpful siloing. It led to the tried and tested and localized and well-understood ways of building being abandoned in favor of the innovative and product-centered, unproven technology being favored over simple and holistic solutions. And Fahrenheit's thermometer is actually an example of exactly that. It's an exciting new toy for the engineers who then hunted for ways to use it. And on the back of it, they developed new theories of comfort that were all based on air temperature, and from that, all sorts of new inventions for heating the air. And of course, without the draperies and rugs, but with big glass windows, the houses of the 18th century must have felt pretty cold. You see stoves appearing here in the north in the early 18th century, followed in the UK by Count Rumford's grates, and those instantly become incredibly fashionable, with rich people putting them in every room, adding massively to London's smog, and also making the houses super drafty, so even more uncomfortable. So I'm not surprised that in the 19th century they put lots of the draperies back again, although they seem to have thought it was just for controlling the drafts. And in the name of archaeology, they went and stripped back the pre-carbon buildings to their bare bones. They knocked off the lime renders that kept them dry, and they even pulled out the ceilings that kept them warm and passively lit. And of course, like all the other they pulled out all the other critical comfort fittings like the draperies and the paneling and the box pews, and then they added in things like coal-fired stoves. But because hot air rises, air heating has all sorts of unintended consequences, like causing drafts. And it's horribly inefficient because essentially what you're trying to do is use warm air to raise the temperature of all the surfaces. You know, also, I'm not even sure that we actually want what all this tight control is meant to deliver. You know, you might possibly be able to make a nice air temperature for someone sitting reading the Sunday paper, but then it's going to be much too hot for them the moment they get up to do the housework. The way they provided comfort in the pre-carbon period handled this effortlessly. You can see here the bride, who has to sit still, has a cloth hung behind her, so she keeps warm without overheating all the other people who are dancing about. Now, you do see early on the thermal physiologists trying to call out the creep of air temperature as a proxy for comfort or health, but they were up against some huge market forces. This is the first constitution of what went on to become ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers, and I think we can agree they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. So it's painfully clear that even as we in the global north introduced more and more sources of thermal discomfort into our buildings, it led us just to throwing more and more fossil fuels at the problem. And once that energy waste becomes an issue in its own right, we start sealing our buildings up, which immediately gives us serious problems with indoor air quality. And again, the solutions get hunted for in technology rather than in science. So here we are now facing the inevitable horrible results of all of this. Well, you know what they say about repeating the same thing time after time, but expecting a different result, that it's the definition of madness. So I reckon it's high time we stopped, took stock, and considered the wisdom of going back and learning again, not just from our own pre-carbon past, from ongoing practice in the global south. And if we can break away from retrofitting as fabric first and focus instead of on people first retrofit, then all those pre-carbon passive systems we could rediscover don't just use very little energy to make and absolutely none to run, but unlike focusing on air temperature and U values and insulation, they actually fit with the background science and they go right to the heart of what's actually causing an individual's discomfort, so they can easily be tweaked for everyone's benefit, whatever people are doing in the space. All of which is not to say that modern necessarily means bad, and of course old isn't always a synonym for good either. They came up with silly ideas in the past too, like parapet gutters. And, you know, plumbing's great, even if we're not very good at it yet. And there are new materials like perspex that have the potential to become real game changers. Ceiling fans are terrific, so much better than the traditional punka wallers. And what about all those wonderful modern tools for warming people rather than the air, like heated blankets and cushions? These work so well, and they're much safer than open flames or hot charcoal. And if we can run these people-centered things directly from nearby renewable sources, we'll really start to be getting to a better place super fast. But we have to be absolutely clear that none of it is about heating or cooling the air. That's absolutely the key to solving the problems currently facing us. Once we realise that, then the wicked problem just untangles itself and all the apparent conflicts between heritage and climate action just evaporate. And in the People First work we're doing currently in England with church groups, we're finding this story really captures hearts and minds. People come up with the most creative solutions that are low risk and cheap and really easy to roll out. So there's my call to arms for us all. Let's stop fighting on the enemy's ground and instead put the occupants and their real needs back at the centre of the picture. As my wonderful colleague Carl says, we really can change the world. Thanks very much.